Welcome back to Performance Process. My name is Ronan Mc Laughlin. I am your host as usual. Today we're talking about gut training. It's the latest buzz in endurance sport, but what does it actually mean and does it work? In this episode, I'm joined once again by accredited sports dietitian and endurance nutrition researcher Dr Alan McCubbin to unpack the science, the hype, and the practical strategies behind gut training. From its roots in research to real-world practices of pro cyclists, this episode explores how and whether you can train your gut to better tolerate carbs, fluids, and food during exercise. And so, let's just crack on with it. Alan, welcome back to the show again. Thanks for joining us.
No, pleasure to be here.
Do you want to just quickly remind listeners who maybe didn't hear our episode on hydration a couple of months ago, just of some of your background?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an accredited sports dietitian, as you said. I've been working for about 20 years in the field, mostly in endurance sports and particularly cycling. Started out writing with cycling tips right back in 2011 and continued through now with Escape Collective as well. I've done some work with UCI continental teams. Obviously, there's no World Tour teams to work with here in Australia. You have to pack up and move to Europe like all our pro riders would. So family sort of prevented me from doing that over the years. But worked over here, worked with Triathlon Australia with their Olympic and Paralympic, some of their athletes in the lead up to Tokyo Olympics as well, but also have a research angle to my work. So I work at Monash University here in Melbourne, and that's actually where the majority of the gut training studies that we're going to talk about today have come from. So I wasn't personally involved in the studies. It's not my research, and I don't want to pretend that it is, but I was sort of able to witness it firsthand being done. So it was cool to witness that and see how it's been kind of taken both in an academic sense, but then because I work as a practitioner in the real world as well.
And Performance Process, this podcast sort of dips in and out of nutrition topics, but you have your own podcast focused on performance nutrition also.
Yeah, that's right. So Fueling Endurance podcast, which has been up and running since 2020. So we sort of tackle common questions, I guess, that runners, cyclists and triathletes ask. And I think we're up to answering question about 94 or 95 by now. Some of those have multiple episodes though. So we have sometimes researchers or practitioners give their perspective, but then also athletes sort of been in those situations as well to give their perspective on things. So it's been going for coming up on 4 years now. So still going strong.
Very good. We'll sort of lay the groundwork just in a second on what gut training is, but maybe could you just give us a one-liner on what gut training is and why this episode matters for both endurance and recreational cyclists alike?
Yeah. So as you said, gut training is kind of a bit of a buzzword at the moment. I think, it's probably to nutrition what zone 2 is to training in a way. But a gut training is essentially the process of trying to get your digestive system to adapt to what you're eating and drinking during exercise for some form of benefit. And we'll talk about the fact that there's different types of gut training and for different purposes or different things that you're trying to achieve. And I think probably from a cycling context, how people perceive gut training is maybe a little bit different to other sporting contexts. In cycling, I think people think more about the grams per hour of carbs because that tends to be what pro cyclists are talking about as they're going, 90, 100, 120, 150, saw the article the other week from Alex Hunt with Unbound, someone getting up to 200 grams an hour of carbs. So a lot of the focus on gut training has been tolerating more and more carbs, which is part of it, but it is only part of it because a lot of the focus in gut training research-wise is actually just improving gut comfort to the volume of stuff rather than the grams of carbs per se.
So it's sort of that, and there's a bit of a misconception around this in terms of, are we training utilization of carbs or are we training the tolerance of just ingesting this much content?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one way I like to describe it is, the carbs are coming in during exercise, so they're coming in your mouth and they've got to make it all the way to your muscle to actually get used. So it's that kind of journey from the mouth to the muscle. And then once they get to the muscle is going to use it. And so one analogy I've come up with recently is kind of there's a bit of a push and a pull to this. So the push is sort of the digestive system, getting those carbs into the blood, into the muscle from the food that we start off. We digest it down, we absorb it. It goes into the bloodstream and then into the muscle. So that's kind of the push aspect. And then the pull aspect is the demand for that carbohydrate in the muscle itself. So actually needing that carbohydrate to produce energy. And obviously that's more of a function of training and the wattage that someone's able to produce which is sort of demanding that carbohydrate, as opposed to getting it into the system, which is more the digestive tract side of it.
So yeah, let's just lay the groundwork just now while we're on this and maybe define what exactly the term and why it matters, what gut training is.
So there's probably three main cases that I would describe of why you would do gut training or what you're trying to achieve with gut training. So we mentioned one already, is just trying to increase the number of grams per hour of carbohydrate that you can digest and absorb during exercise. Bearing in mind, while we're exercising, we generally have less blood flow to the gut, which means that the function of the gut is probably not as optimal as it would be if we were just sitting on the couch at home doing nothing. So the gut probably does have to work a little bit harder or under a little bit more duress because there's less blood flow, less oxygen supply to it, because that oxygen on that blood flow is going to the muscles. In particularly hot weather, it's also going to the skin to try and get rid of extra body heat. So the gut's having to work under not optimal conditions to do this, which is why it's probably harder during exercise than it is not during exercise. So that's one of them, is trying to get more carbohydrate from the food extracted, absorbed into the bloodstream without being what we call malabsorbed, which is basically if that carbs passes through the small intestine and can't be absorbed for whatever reason, it passes through into the large intestine, which is where all our bacteria live, and they'll munch on it and produce gas, and that's when you get the bloating and sometimes diarrhea and some of those lower gastrointestinal symptoms that people can sometimes get during exercise. That's malabsorption. So trying to reduce that as you take in higher and higher amounts of carbs. And so that process of getting the carbs from food, drinks, gels, whatever it is, into the bloodstream, it's depending on the form of the carbohydrate that it comes in, it may have to digest it down into individual sugar molecules. Glucose and fructose are the main two. Galactose is the third, but that's half of lactose, and you generally don't see that very often in sports nutrition products. So it's generally glucose and fructose. We're trying to break, whether it's from drinks, the maltodextrin or the gels, whether it's real food that you might be eating, rice cakes or bread or something like that, then it's going to be starches. So we've got to break down all those chains so that starch gets broken down into glucose. So that's the first part of it. And then there's the absorption, actually getting that absorbed across the wall of the gut and into the bloodstream itself. The third part of that process probably links to the other two reasons that we do gut training, and that's more general tolerance of the volume of food or fluids that's in our gut during exercise. So it's not necessarily about digesting it. It's about the fact that when we first put it in, it's going to go and sit in our stomach, and that acts a little bit like a funnel. It kind of holds it and then releases it from the bottom at a particular rate. And that's important, that rate of release, because if we just dumped it all too quickly, there is actually a medical condition called dumping syndrome. If you released all of that carbs or whatever mix of food and nutrients and things into the out of the stomach all at once, the body wouldn't be able to digest it and absorb it properly, and a lot of it would get malabsorbed and cause a lot of problems. So the stomach is very good at controlling the rate that it empties. Now, that part, as far as we can tell, isn't amenable to gut training. There's no evidence at the moment that we can speed up the gastric emptying part through gut training, but it's more the tolerance. It's how the stomach expands when we eat something to accommodate that volume while still feeling relatively comfortable. That's both the volume of food, solid foods, but then also fluids specifically. So you have some athletes that might need gut training because they're going to go and do a race or Gran Fondo or whatever it is in a very hot environment. They're going to sweat a lot, so they need a lot of fluid, but they're training in a cold environment and they're not used to drinking that much fluid. And so the gut just isn't used to that. If they don't eat particularly big meals, that probably makes it worse, because obviously the stomach stretches outside of exercise as well. And so for them, they may need to do some purposeful sort of fluid-based gut training. And then other people, it's more, particularly for real foods, solid foods and things, training that aspect a little bit more as well. So they're kind of the three main aspects that we're trying to train.
And it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that while we're exercising and need the gut to be able to process these carbs, it's challenged in doing that. And when we don't need such high carb rates, we're sitting on the sofa, we can, or it does work better. But as you say there, the gut kind of has three key functions during exercise, and they are tolerating food and fluid in the stomach, digesting nutrients into absorbable forms, and absorbing those nutrients into the bloodstream. Now, you've written entire article for Escape Collective that went up probably by the time listeners are hearing this episode, probably a few weeks ago at this point. It was just 3 or 4 days before the Tour de France kicked off. So if you're looking for it, you can find it back there. But in that, you've also said that the gut is an adaptable system. It can be trained, and you give some similarities to like heat or altitude adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, pretty much any part of human anatomy and physiology is adaptable to some extent to its environment. And, you mentioned there heat and altitude, and there's some good examples. Obviously, the way our muscles adapt just to training, whether that's on the bike or in the gym or whatever. I mean, that's a form of adaptation, and the gut is no different. So that will adapt to its circumstances. Taking one extreme example, thinking about the carbohydrate scenario, if we were to suddenly go keto tomorrow, cut pretty much all the carbs out of our diet, a few things will happen, both in the muscle and in the gut as well. Our body, after a few days with not much carbohydrate coming in, is going to say, well, why would I bother producing all these digestive enzymes to break down carbohydrate when there's really not much to break down? Like, that's just a waste of limited resources. And so your body will start producing less of those, and presumably it's going to have a lot more fat coming in. So it's going to produce more of the enzymes for digesting fat down, for example. Then there's also, as you said, the absorption of the carbohydrate. So it's one thing to break it down into those sugars, and another thing to actually successfully absorb that through the lining of the gut into the bloodstream. And so we have these transporters that sit on the cells lining our gut that allow that process to happen. And there's two separate types of transporters that are relevant to carbohydrate. One absorbs the glucose and any galactose that might be around, and the other one absorbs fructose, which is why people talk about this multiple transportable carbohydrates as glucose and fructose as two separate things, because you can feed them both through that wall at the same time, and it's additive. Also, with those, we suspect that probably if you go on a really low-carb diet, you'll probably reduce the amount of those transporters that you produce on the cell walls. And so if you then suddenly, stop your keto diet and go back to eating, 500 grams of carbs or something, you're probably going to get a lot of gut issues on day 1 and 2 because your body can't break it down and can't absorb it all properly. So you're going to get horrible malabsorption and all the side effects that go along with that. So that's one example of adaptation. The other one that we see, and the really stark example of this, is actually in competitive eating, of all things. So these are the guys who do like the hot dog eating contests and things like that. So, those guys can down, 50 or 60 hot dogs, including the bun, in 10 or 12 minutes. Now, how do they do that? Because, as I said, the stomach doesn't empty at a faster rate because that would cause other problems. So that's all got to sit in the stomach, that funnel at the top part there. So how do you fit 50 hot dogs in the stomach at the top? And the answer is that the stomach adapts, and it can learn to stretch and accommodate a bigger volume of stuff sitting in there. And that's not something that happens overnight. It's not something you're necessarily born with. It's something that you have to train over a period of time. And so those guys that do the competitive eating, they'll spend weeks, if not months, training their stomach to stretch and expand to accommodate that volume of things. And if you're ever interested, it's pretty disgusting, but you can go to YouTube and look up, there's an ESPN video about how competitive eaters train, and they've got this sort of simulated stomach, and they shove all these 50 hot dogs and all the water into it, and it expands up so much that it starts displacing all the other organs. It's so full in the end, and the ability to do that without it all just coming back up again is quite incredible. But it really speaks to the adaptability of the gastrointestinal tract. In that case, the stomach, and as I said before, the enzymes and the transporters more for getting the carbs in itself.
You mentioned one point there, this isn't something you're born with, you have to adapt it. And I wanted to ask you just about that, because I've long since had a theory that the only talent I had on a bike was how much I could eat. And actually, I once won an eating competition in college by going first and eating all the Weetabix that we had brought in for this eating contest. Nice. And so I'm wondering, how much of it is just you're born with a certain capacity and then you can train that up or down, but you're always going to be limited by what the body wants to do or can do.
Yeah, I don't think we know, really, to be honest. I don't think anyone's ever done a PhD on the genetic talent of competitive eaters, or whether your ability, Ronan, was given to you at birth or something that you trained over many years of riding a lot and eating a lot. I don't think we know is the simple answer. I mean, what we do know, I guess, is that some people are more prone to gut issues no matter what they do, which maybe suggests that there's some, individual element of that, but whether it's genetic or something else is hard to say because I don't think we really know enough about it.
I mean, whether it's coincidental or what, certainly anecdotal at best, but it does seem like the complaints about stomach issues, despite the move towards the high carb intake, you hear them less and less these days. And I wonder if that's partly, the high carb trend taking over. And so athletes are just doing it more in training, which is preparing them for race day. And so it's less of an issue then because they are adapting. And maybe also something to do with, the more balanced ratios that you mentioned earlier, or the new ratios that you mentioned earlier that we're now getting in carbohydrate products.
Yeah, as in like the glucose and the fructose.
Yeah,
exactly. So I mean that's certainly a part of it. I know speaking to one of the nutritionists, actually he doesn't work in cycling anymore, but up until last year he did with one of the World Tour teams. I was asking him about this on my podcast about whether they had to spend a lot of time with the Neo Pros when they first come in, getting them adapted to these higher carb intakes. And he said, well, actually, no, most of them now, by the time they're getting to World Tour level, they've been doing it for a few years already. And that is a huge contrast, not only at development level, but even at World Tour level to, 10 or 15 years ago where, these sort of levels of carb intake were kind of unheard of. But I guess the other thing, and speaking to Tim Podlegar, who works with Tudor Pro Cycling now, I was speaking to him as I was sort of putting the article together, and there's a couple of quotes from him in there. And he was talking about the fact that, gut training, we assume that it needs to be done around the time of exercise, and that kind of makes sense. But in reality, like the ability for the stomach to expand, that can happen in response to breakfast, lunch, and dinner, not just what we're eating and drinking on the bike. And it can happen, the digestion and absorption of a lot of carbohydrate, that can happen from eating carbs off the bike as much as what we eat on the bike. So, gut training probably has elements of both. I think there's still, and I'm sure we'll get onto it later in terms of how to go about it, but I think there's still value in doing specific on-bike gut training because, as we said, there are things that are different about how the gut kind of functions during exercise compared to at rest. But, there is probably an element there as well. And coming back to your question before of, are we born with this talent or is it something that's trained? Some of it probably seems like we're born with the talent, but it might also relate to, the size of the main meals that we eat and our pattern of eating. Do we sort of graze on small amounts of food across the day, or do we eat three, or two or three massive meals through the day? That probably has some impact on all of this as well.
I do both. Graze and eat
all of the above.
We had Tim Podlegar on the podcast about a year and a half ago now, just discussing how to do high carb at the time. And, one of the key points that he was making then was, it's not just, which I've heard you make also, it's not just about eating more and more carbs. It's about matching expenditure and intake and demand and just eating the right amount. And for generations of cyclists, it was almost like this mentality that eating is cheating and you had to eat as little as possible to get as light as possible. And it's completely flipped now in that eating is cheating in that the more you can eat, the better you can perform. But before we go any further, I do want to sort of just, especially around the idea of gut training off the bike. And, there could definitely be benefits to having better and bigger meals before and after training, and both in terms of performance and recovery. But again, just keeping somewhere in the back of our mind that, if we're only doing a 30-minute recovery ride, we probably don't need to be doing 200 grams of carbs per hour for an hour before it, the half hour during and an hour after.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wrote an article about this probably about a year ago on Escape Collective as well, so people can go back and have a look at that. But, the main determinant of how much carbs you actually need during a ride is based on what we call the absolute exercise intensity. So it's not how you're going relative to FTP. It's just simply the raw watts that you're doing. That's the energy expended. And that's, obviously some of that's from fat, but it also determines to a large extent the demand for carbohydrate. And so, you can have two cyclists, quote unquote, riding in zone 2. One's a professional and one's a recreational cyclist who's just starting out. They're going to have completely different power outputs in their same zone 2 ride. One of them might be 300 and something watts and the other one might be 120 or 130 watts. And so, one of them is literally doing double the power output, double the calorie expenditure, probably double the carbohydrate need of the other. And so, we do need to bear that in mind, that just because professional cyclists are, chomping back, 150, 200 grams an hour of carbs, if you're not riding at that kind of power output for that amount of time, you're not going to need that.
One last thing just before we move on to the science, but are like the gut training recommendations that you have in the article and that we're discussing here today, are they agnostic of rider sex, or would female riders approach things differently than males?
Yeah, it is a good question. I mean, we'll talk about the studies. There's very few of them at the moment, and I think we just simply don't have enough information yet to know whether there's any sort of sex-specific differences here. Thankfully, the studies that we do have pretty good sort of male and female representation, which is not common in a lot of areas of sports science and sports nutrition research, so that's a good thing. But I'm not sure that we have enough data yet to clearly say the responses are similar or quite different. At this stage, I think we're not even at the stage of having clear guidelines on what you should do for gut training for anyone, let alone sex-specific guidelines.
So what does the science then say, the research that is out there at the moment? What are we hearing?
Yeah, well, it's pretty slim pickings, to be honest, for all the talk about gut training. A lot of it, or the majority of it, is probably more anecdotal than it is science-based. So, as I said before, there's kind of three different reasons that we might gut train. One is just the tolerance of the volume of food. One is the tolerance specifically of fluid. And one is tolerance of just the grams per hour of carbohydrate, regardless of the volume of what that comes in. So if we have a look at the research that's been done, the first study relevant to these was published in 2008 from Creighton University in the US. And that had 5 females and 2 males, which is unusual that the females outnumber the males, but it does in this study. This was a fluid tolerance study specifically. So they got people basically to do 6 training sessions, drinking enough fluid to replace 100% of their sweat losses. Now, to be clear, we don't actually recommend that from a hydration point of view. No one actually should ever need to replace 100% of their sweat losses. It was done specifically for the gut training purpose in this study, not because they need that much fluid.
If the listener wants to know why, we have the previous episode with yourself, Alan, we've covered that in great detail.
Yeah.
We have 3 articles on Escape Collective detailing hydration.
Absolutely, yeah. But what they found was that the gut tolerance to that volume of fluid, which I think off the top of my head, the average obviously differed from one person to the next, was about 1 litre an hour. And it gradually improved over those 6 sessions. So it's only 6 training sessions. Obviously, you could gut train over a lot more than that. But in a study, you usually have to kind of rein in the scope that you're asking people to do it. And then, if you do it for too long, other factors start to come into there as well. So they did see that improvement. What they also measured was that gastric emptying. So basically how quickly the stomach empties that fluid out into the small intestine, and there was no change in that rate. So that comes back to what I was saying before, that as far as we know, that part of it isn't trainable, but the stomach stretching to accommodate that fluid comfortably is. And that's a good example of that. So that's the only fluid-specific study to date.
I hadn't actually, in considering gut training over the last year or two, I hadn't really thought of fluid. Again, getting back to those misconceptions and thinking about high carb and all, I was thinking more about tolerating carb intake. But yeah, just interesting that the first study you cite there is a fluid-based one.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you can be in situations, and I've seen this a lot, people training through the winter here where you don't really need very much fluid, maybe 200-300 mils an hour or something. But then you're going to go over and travel to Europe to do, I don't know, L'Etape or something like that in a couple of weeks' time, or it'll be over by the time people listen to this, and it might be 35 degrees, and all of a sudden you go from needing 200 or 300 mils an hour of fluid to needing maybe 1 litre or more an hour of fluid, because your sweat rate is just going to go through the roof with the type of riding and the weather conditions that you're in. And so that can be a really important part, almost to go hand in hand with sort of heat training as you're preparing for a hot environment, is that tolerance of fluid, and remembering that your fluid requirements are probably going to increase as you go to that hot environment.
Sorry, you were going to mention the next study?
Yeah. So there were 2 studies published in 2017, and this is really where the term gut training, I think, kind of kicked off. So there was a review paper that kind of touched on the concept that gut training might be a thing. It was actually published before these 2 studies. But one of these kind of introduced that term gut training, and they were both from Monash University where I work. And as I said, I wasn't personally involved in these studies, but I know the students who were doing it, and I was sort of in and around the lab as it was being done. And I'm pretty sure these two different studies, there's two papers, but and the number of participants is slightly different, but I think there's a crossover. I think this was part of a bigger study, and they broke it into two sections on different sort of outcomes. And it was almost a 50-50 mix. I think it was 18, like if you combine these two studies together, there was 18 females and 25 males. These were runners, as was the previous study. I forgot to mention that. And what they did in this study was more around that carbs per hour tolerance. So they got them to do what they called a tolerance test at the start. So they got them to go for a run for 2 hours at a kind of a steady pace, taking in 90 grams an hour of carbs, which in this day and age doesn't sound like that much, but back in 2017, that was a fair bit, and particularly for runners compared to cyclists. So they were taking 90 grams an hour of carbs, deliberately, I guess, feeding them over and above what people were kind of used to. So the point was, if we overfeed them with carbs, how do they react, kind of thing, in terms of symptoms, in terms of that malabsorption of things not getting absorbed into the body. And then they did 10 training sessions over 2 weeks. So basically each weekday, they would get them to go for an hour run, not a massive pace or anything like that, taking in that 90 grams an hour during that 1 hour run. So they did that 5 days a week for 2 weeks, and then they came back to the lab and repeated the tolerance test afterwards. And what they found basically was a pretty significant reduction in gut symptoms, a reduction in malabsorption, which suggests that more of that carbohydrate was actually making its way into the blood. But interestingly, when they, and an improvement in performance, so they tacked on a performance trial onto the end. So they did the 2 hours of just a steady state run with the 90 grams an hour of carbs, and then they stopped feeding them, and then they did a 1 hour, what we call a distance trial. So if you think about the hour record in cycling, like how far can you go in an hour? It's the same concept, just running on a treadmill. Not pleasant. But they saw an improvement in performance in that after the gut training with the 90 grams an hour compared to the group that did the gut training with a placebo that had no carbs. So there was an improvement in performance there. And then they had the mask on to actually measure carbohydrate versus fat use. And what they saw actually was that the total amount of carbs that they were using wasn't any different, whether they'd done the gut training or not. So it seems like more carbs were getting into the system, into the bloodstream, presumably delivered to the muscle, although you can't sort of directly measure that. But it wasn't displacing fat in terms of the amount of carbs that were being used for energy, despite the better performance. So the conclusion from that was probably that, yes, they were performing better, but they were probably performing better because they felt more comfortable. They had less gut symptoms, and that was what was improving their performance, rather than we're delivering more carbs to the muscles and therefore they're able to run faster because of that. Now, obviously, these weren't elite or professional runners or anything like that. So I guess the caveat around that is, as I said before, there's that kind of push and pull. So this suggests that the gut training could improve the push, but if they're not necessarily getting fitter, they're not necessarily improving the pull side of that. So if you don't have that extra demand or capacity to use that carbohydrate, then stuffing more and more in won't necessarily help you if you can't actually use it. So it is an interesting finding, and I think that sort of kind of push-pull part, because up until that point, it had kind of been assumed that the digestive tract was the single bottleneck in this whole process. If you could push more in, it would equal, kind of better results, better performance, that sort of thing. And this suggested, maybe if it reduces symptoms, which is common in runners, less common in cyclists, but not necessarily going to improve performance unless you've got the capacity to use it, which in your world tour level cyclists, clearly you're going to, and you see that when you go from underfeeding 30, 40, 50 grams an hour to now 150. Clearly there's pull there for that, and they've been underfed for a long time, as opposed to people that were probably being fed relatively appropriately, and feeding more isn't necessarily going to help them.
You mentioned there that they wore the mask and that was able to analyze the carb to fat that they were using. But how do they measure what the uptake is from the gut? How did they measure that there is more carbs getting through the gut?
Yeah, so they didn't measure that directly in terms of carbohydrate use. So when you stick a mask on, just like you do in a VO2 max test, you measure the total amount of fat and total amount of carbohydrate that's being used, but you can't differentiate where the carbohydrate comes from. Is it coming from the stores that were already in your muscles, the glycogen that was already in there before you started? Or is it coming from the drinks and gels and things that you're taking during exercise? It's what we call endogenous in the body versus exogenous coming from outside the body. There is a technique that can be used to differentiate those two. It's been used in other areas of research, and that involves using what's called an isotope tracer. Basically, when you give the carbs with the carbon part of the carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You make the carbon part of that a different isotope of carbon, so it's carbon-13 instead of, it's mostly usually carbon-12. And because that carbon will travel through and then get produced out as carbon dioxide in that whole process of turning it into energy, as you breathe out, you're breathing out that carbon-13 and obviously carbon-12 in a mix. And so by taking breath samples and being able to differentiate those, you can actually estimate how much of that carbohydrate you're burning during exercise is coming from the drinks and gels and things versus what was already in the body when you started. But that process has never actually been done in a gut training study. So we kind of naturally assume, well, we feed more carbs in, they'll get turned into more energy. But we actually don't have any evidence of that yet because it hasn't been studied.
The way I often think about it is it's maybe more of a sort of flux rate thing in that you've got the stores in the liver and the body before you start. And while previously when we were underfueled, those stores were depleted, we can either keep the stores topped up or top them up. And so it's like maybe using a device while it's plugged into the wall and charging. We're charging as we go along, which then leads to performance gains if you're doing a Tour de France stage, which is 6 hours long and requires a significant effort in the final. But if you're doing, again, a 1 hour ride, your battery would have been sufficient to get you through anyway.
Yeah, and that is where it has become a little bit controversial academically as well.
So that's just my assumption, by the way. There's no science behind that.
No, I think it's a great analogy of sort of running it on battery power versus having it plugged in at the same time. I think Tim as well was involved in a study that they looked at feeding, again, they weren't pro-level cyclists, but feeding 90 grams versus 120 grams an hour of carbohydrate during a ride. I can't remember the details off the top of my head. But basically what they showed in that was that when they fed 120 grams an hour, they were okay at getting it into the system, but it didn't actually, and they measured that exogenous versus endogenous. They could increase the total amount of carbs that were burnt during exercise, but they couldn't actually, it didn't prevent the glycogen being used up. If anything, it used it up more quickly rather than less quickly. So the extra carbs were coming in, were being used at the expense of fat rather than at the expense of the stored carbohydrate. So speaking to Tim about it, and it's in the article as well, his sort of thoughts around this are, okay, well, we feed carbs up to a certain point. Feeding more isn't necessarily going to kind of save or preserve that glycogen for later necessarily. It may use it up just as quickly. But as he also said in the article, but by the time you get to the end of a 6 or 7 hour stage, that might still be advantageous anyway.
You'd mentioned like one of the potential side effect benefits could be just, more oomph at the end of a long stage, or being able to perform better towards the end of a race. But in the article, you'd also briefly mentioned just about potential for on-bike recovery. Do you want to delve into that a little bit? Or
yeah, so it was one of the things that Tim mentioned when we were talking about sort of these higher and higher carb intakes, and why, if as he said, like clearly if you're not turning into energy, then it's like, well, what's the point? But he said, well, there might be, and again, this is not based on any kind of theory or research, it's just kind of him hypothesizing. He said, well, maybe if we're getting all these extra carbs into the muscle that either don't need to be used immediately or can't be used immediately because we don't have that pull, then maybe, on a descent or something like that, it's going to start to restore some of that glycogen, recharge that battery, as you said, plug the device back in temporarily. And that may sort of help by the time you get to, a sprint finish or an uphill finish at the end of a stage or something like that. The other thing, as he said quite rightly, is, if you're consuming a lot of that carbs in the last hour or two of exercise, some of that's barely being digested and absorbed into the gut by the time you've actually crossed your finish line and started cooling down. And so some of it also may go towards restoring that glycogen for the recovery immediately after you stop riding as well. And we know that the body's ability to restore that glycogen is sort of optimal in that first hour or two after exercise. And so if you've already got stuff entering the system ready to go, not waiting for you to stop riding, find something to eat or drink, have that, digest and absorb all of that, there's going to be a delay there. And so that was his other theory as well, maybe just having some of that immediately on tap when you stop exercising allows the muscle to go to work and restore that glycogen a bit more quickly and completely. And certainly anecdotally, a lot of athletes that you talk to when they go sort of a lot higher carb, some of them say, well, I don't necessarily feel that it's improving my performance massively during my ride or run, but it's the recovery afterwards. It's like not feeling completely wiped out and have to lie down on the couch watching TV for the rest of the day. I can get on with my day like it's any other day, even though I've done a 5-hour ride this morning, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's another example of the mindset shift that high carb has brought along. And like, I remember not just training, but even racing, maybe a decade ago and getting towards the end of the race and maybe feeling like I did need some sort of gel or bar or drink or something, and thinking to myself, well, it's not even going to be digested by the time I get to the finish. There's no point in taking it now. Versus nowadays thinking, well, if I take it now, it's going to be helping me from as soon as it is digested, which may be after the finish, but that will help me in tomorrow's stage or tomorrow's training or today's recovery or this, that and the other. So okay, folks, that's where we're cutting off the free version of this podcast this week. Just a reminder, if you head over to escapecollective.com/member, you can sign up now and you can get the entire podcast uninterrupted. You'll not have me butting in to cut you off or to remind you that you're not yet a member. And in doing so, you will be helping to ensure this podcast continues for many more episodes and months and years to come. So head over escapecollective.com/member now to sign up to Escape Collective and to get the entire episode of Performance Process along with all of the other podcasts and written content that we publish on our website.